Right now in Abu Dhabi, peace talks between the US, Ukraine and Russia are taking place under the roar of Russian missiles and the wreckage of the energy truce. Spring of peace or spring of lies? Kyiv is going all in while the Kremlin is playing for the long haul. Ukraine is turning the negotiations around, firmly, specifically and without compromise. Moscow is still trying to stall for time and deceive the world. I'll tell you all the details next. Ukraine welcomes you today. This is Rinat Aslanov with the latest events. The participants of the trilateral Ukraine-USRF negotiations have arrived in Abu Dhabi. According to the publication Politica, citing informed Ukrainian and American sources, the negotiations that have begun in Abu Dhabi could pave the way to ending the conflict as early as this spring. Noticeable changes in the nature of the dialogue are being observed.
Previously, these negotiations were like pulling teeth without anesthesia. Before, I wanted to scream every time I saw another report saying that the discussions were constructive. But now I think that, in a way, they actually are constructive. I notice that the Russians are approaching these negotiations more seriously. I am cautiously optimistic that we have a reasonable chance to end this conflict in the spring.
Moreover, experts note that it is becoming increasingly difficult for Putin to explain the enormous cost of the war to Russian society. Without an obvious victory,
Putin has almost nothing to show except for the massive expenditures on the war. An agreement to resolve the issue through negotiations. Now, when he cannot claim a clear victory, for Russia and for the Russian people, this will be a major domestic problem.
The meetings scheduled for Wednesday and Thursday will take place both in a bilateral US format and in a trilateral format. Ukraine is ready to discuss security guarantees. At the same time, work is underway on documents for the restoration and further development of the state. Government teams are actively working on them.
It is important that during this time, America also firmly supports the dialogue. All opportunities for dialogue that exist and accordingly works with the Russian side. So that Russian terror does not derail what can be achieved.
The main thing for this round of negotiations is substantive discussions, more constructive engagement from Russia. Territorial issues remain the most problematic. The energy truce has been disrupted. The discussion is about technical aspects and there is little chance for a political breakthrough. Let us recall that the Kremlin changed the composition of its negotiating team from empty-talking diplomats to professional military personnel because the composition of the Ukrainian delegation changed. The new head of the presidential office, Kirill Budanov, officially joined it, and the head of the Servant of the People faction, David Arakemia. After that, the nature of communication changed not only with the Americans, but also with Russia. That is why the updated Russian delegation is now headed by the chief of the GRU, Igor Kostyukov. And now the negotiators from Kyiv and Moscow are discussing very specific matters. Mechanisms for troop withdrawal, guarantees, timelines. Moscow's willingness to move toward a peaceful settlement may be linked to a desire to slow down the militarization of Europe.
A peace agreement, an end to the war, could significantly weaken this momentum. It will be much harder for European leaders to convince their voters to make the sacrifices necessary to shift to higher defense spending.
U.S. President Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner will take part in trilateral talks between Ukraine, the U.S. and Russia on February 4th through 5th in Abu Dhabi. This was announced by the White House press secretary.
The president continues to pursue a determined diplomatic policy to bring this war to an end. Special Envoy Witkoff and Jared Kushner will be in Abu Dhabi to conduct another round of trilateral negotiations.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine today. Join us now.
According to her, the trilateral talks are historic as never before. Previously, all three countries had not had the opportunity to sit down at the negotiating table to move things forward toward peace.
Special Envoy Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and President Trump made the impossible possible when it comes to peace in the Middle East. And I know they are striving to do the same regarding the war between Russia and Ukraine.
The new round of negotiations may show whether the Kremlin is truly ready for compromises and to end the war. But all this is happening against the backdrop of Russian strikes on Ukraine, even though the world's great powers had promised an energy truce. We
are awaiting a response from the United States of America to the Russian strikes. This proposal came specifically from America. To halt strikes on the energy sector during diplomacy and such a cold winter season. There was a personal request from the President of the United States. We see that Russia responded to this request with a record number of ballistic strikes. Not even 4 days have passed out of the week that Russia was asked for. This says everything about the rest of Russia's promises or anything else they might promise. If they can't keep their word even now, what can we expect in the future?
But the President of America has once again been misinformed.
The pause lasted from Sunday to Sunday. It ended, and now Putin has dealt them a heavy blow. Putin kept his word. A week is a long time. We will accept everything.
Notably, Russia spent almost millions on shelling Ukraine on the night of February 3rd, according to the GUR. The enemy launched 562 aerial attack assets, missiles, and drones. Their total cost amounts to $325 million. With these funds, an autonomous district of the Russian Federation with a population of about 144,000 people, or the city of Kaluga with a population of over 320,000, could have lived comfortably year-round.
Instead of improving living conditions and developing infrastructure in its own regions, the Kremlin spent this money on strikes against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. At the same time, most of the resources spent turned out to be useless. Ukrainian air defense destroyed 450 aerial targets.
The Kremlin will likely try to present its supposed observance of an energy truce as a significant concession in order to gain leverage in negotiations. This is reported in a study by the Institute for the Study of War.
The Russian government in the Kremlin will likely try to present its observance of this brief and temporary suspension of energy strikes as a highly significant concession, in order to secure a much stronger position of influence in future peace negotiations, even though it clearly used these few days to accumulate a massive stockpile of advanced missiles for a much larger scale attack.
At the same time, the Institute emphasizes that this truce is not a significant concession on Russia's part, since Russian forces continued to strike Ukrainian logistics. And during the moratorium, the target simply shifted from one objective to another. Notably, Ukraine is not counting on Western security guarantees in a future peace deal. This is reported by Politico. As the publication notes, there is growing doubt in Kyiv about the reliability of external commitments, particularly due to the US president's refusal to consider Ukraine's NATO membership. Under these circumstances, Ukraine is implementing the so-called Plan B, turning the country into a steel porcupine, capable of independently repelling new aggression. Due to the uncertainty surrounding international commitments, the main focus is on strengthening Ukraine's own army and increasing the country's defense potential. That is why Ukraine insists on maintaining a force of up to 800,000 troops, even in peacetime. Additionally, according to experts, Ukraine's future security also depends on the stability of its production, armaments, and technologies.
What matters is not individual systems or technological breakthroughs, but the ability of industry to operate for a long time, under pressure, and with predictable results.
Within 72 hours, American and European soldiers will be in Ukraine. This implies security guarantees from partners in the event of another attack by the aggressors on Ukraine after the signing of a peace agreement. More details in the following report.
A warning within 24 hours and a military strike within 72 hours, with the involvement of NATO troops. The security guarantees for official Kyiv have become known, guarantees that have been discussed since last year by delegations from the US, Europe, and Ukraine. According to information from the Financial Times, Kyiv and its partners in Europe and the US have agreed on a multi-level plan designed to ensure Russia's compliance with a future ceasefire agreement in the war with Ukraine.
The first response to Russia's violation of the ceasefire will come within 24 hours. It will include diplomatic warnings and actions by the Ukrainian army necessary to stop the violation, according to 3 sources, to the Financial Times. If hostilities continue, a second phase of intervention will be launched involving coalition forces of willing countries.
In particular, to support the armed forces of Ukraine, on the 3rd day, the United States, several EU members, as well as the United Kingdom, Norway, Iceland, and Turkey are ready.
The United Kingdom and France have promised to send troops and weapons to Ukraine as part of security guarantees supported by the United States, which are intended to reinforce a 20-point peace plan aimed at ending the war, according to the publication. Europe-led deterrence forces will be responsible for operations in the air, at sea, and on land after the ceasefire, with intelligence and logistical support from the United States.
Meanwhile, analysts note that the details of the agreement remain unclear, since it implies actions by the Allies after a ceasefire in Ukraine, while the terms of a possible truce have yet to be agreed upon. Additionally, the security guarantees have not yet been formalized with signatures, which also allows some countries to withdraw from future commitments. In
any case, this deployment will be based on our own army. The second part is EU membership as a component of security guarantees and the backstop force, which will be provided by the United States. But this will become clear later when certain documents are signed and approved by the US Congress. What will this look like? Ultimately, it depends on what the Europeans are willing to agree to. If Russia attacks us again, and what actions the United States will take.
At the same time, the NATO Secretary General, who arrived in Kiev on February 3rd and experienced firsthand what a massive shelling of the Ukrainian capital is like, assured the following: the alliance countries that supported the plan will not abandon it.
Ukraine needs security guarantees and commitments that we will come to its aid when necessary. To this end, the Coalition of the Willing provides for a system of backstop guarantees from the United States and the provision of military assistance to the armed forces in Ukraine.
At the same time, experts are already raising questions. How exactly can NATO armies help us if in Europe we keep hearing statements that the alliance will only be ready for war in the 2030s?
What kind of military response is this, you might ask, considering that, as we've discussed many times, Europe simply doesn't have the forces needed to operate on the ground in sufficient numbers. This is mainly a story about aviation, because where Russia has a significant advantage is precisely in the skies. And in fact, if European armies had intervened for Ukraine in terms of air power, for example, at the start of the full-scale invasion, if they had closed the skies over Ukraine so that Russian planes simply couldn't fly there, the situation would have developed very differently. At the
same time, the leak of Ukrainian guarantees to the British press on the eve of the talks, which many believe was not accidental, plays a crucial role in the negotiations in the Ukraine-USA-Russia format, which will continue today so that Putin's team understands in advance. It is pointless to demand that support for post-war Ukraine be abandoned.
In the context of, for example, the negotiations currently underway, of course, this not only can but must become one of the elements of the security guarantee system that will be offered to Ukraine. This is a very important point. This absolutely must be included. It should be stipulated, and it may concern both NATO as a whole and individual countries separately, for example. Moreover, we have more than 24 security agreements with various countries. And these agreements guarantee us certain types of support: consultative, financial, military, technical, and various other forms, which, without a doubt, form the foundation of the country's future security.
As is being noted more and more often in Europe, this is also the foundation of their own security. Against the backdrop of unidentified drones flying over, the open transfer of warship units to Belarus with an eye on the EU, and the restoration of Russian military bases on the NATO border, Ukraine is ceasing to be a buffer zone and is becoming almost the main guarantor of Europe's security.
Now, Europe and Ukraine are already forming an inseparable and indivisible system of European security, as it is called in the European capitals themselves. It became clear that Ukraine is not a buffer, but rather a part of the common European security space. After all, without Ukraine, Europe thought it was stronger and that Ukraine was just a buffer. But it turned out that's not the case. Without Ukraine, Europe is much weaker, and with Ukraine, on the contrary, it can become stronger.
At the same time, how Russia will react to the information about Ukrainian guarantees, we will find out very soon as Putin is briefed, that Dmitriev and his associates failed today to persuade the West to back down.
Trump's multi-step strategy. The American president openly sings Putin's praises, assuring him of friendly intentions. Meanwhile, silently and methodically, he is kicking the chair out from under the Kremlin dictator, who is hanging by a thread. Venezuela is cooperating with India attacks on the shadow fleet. These are all points of a single cunning plan. And we will prove it to you. Is this friendship or a game of survival?
A very good afternoon to you, my dear neighbor. It truly is a wonderful sight to see you doing so well, staying both alive and in such excellent health today.
Trump is determined to strangle Russia.
American oil companies will enter Venezuela.
The US president has pulled out the economic and petrodollar noose that Putin was so afraid of. And
they will clamp down on our oil. Well, at least clamp down on it somehow, although they won't be able to do it. It's simply impossible, in fact, as of today.
Putin's entire economy is tied to one single factor: world oil prices. Venezuela has been in the game for years.
Based on the latest data from geointelligence, approximately 1/5 of the entire world's proven oil reserves are currently situated within the borders of Venezuela.
Since 2020, the Russian state company Rossarubezhneft has acquired stakes in almost all of the country's key oil projects. For Moscow, this was strategic gold. The Kremlin gained leverage over the total volume of oil on the global market.
Venezuela served as an important representative of the interests, if you will, of the countries of the global south, and above all, of China and the Russian Federation on the continent.
Many countries were hooked on Putin's oil needle. But after the operation in Venezuela and the arrest of Nicolas Maduro, this scheme fell apart.
Maduro is a staunch and vocal supporter of Putin, among various other political alliances. And this, of course, will undoubtedly deal a significant blow to Putin, because it directly impacts the operations of the oil tanker fleet. A significant and substantial amount of Russian oil, including shipments sent directly to Venezuela, undergoes extensive processing at various oil refineries, and is then eventually sold to the United States of America as finished products. So it would seem, what does the Russian Federation have to do with it? What does Putin have to do with it? But in reality, the United States is buying their raw materials just through Venezuelan refineries.
The fate of Venezuelan oil fields now depends entirely on the administration of Donald Trump.
Oil and gas are not our advantage. As you can see, both oil and gas can drop in price. Our advantage is Putin.
India is one of the world's largest buyers of oil. It supported the Kremlin thanks to its purchases. But now that won't happen anymore. Modi will start buying oil from Venezuela in exchange for a trade deal with the United States.
He agreed to stop buying Russian oil and to buy much more from the United States and potentially from Venezuela. This will help end the war in Ukraine, which is ongoing right now, with thousands dying every week.
Trump reached an agreement with Modi that the US will lower tariffs on Indian imports from 25% to 18%, and India will move toward a complete removal of tariffs and non-tariff barriers for imports from the US. Let us recall that in August, Trump imposed tariffs of 50% on goods from India, which included a 25% surcharge as a punitive measure for purchasing Russian oil. That's why such a deal was very relevant for Modi. He also promised to buy more than $50 billion worth of American products.
When two large economies and the world's biggest democratic countries work together, it benefits our peoples and opens up tremendous opportunities for mutual cooperation.
This will deal a serious blow to the Kremlin because it was India that became the largest maritime buyer of Russian oil after 2022, and that oil was being sold at a discount. This money was one of the key ways to replenish the Russian budget at a time when sales of Russian gas and oil to the West had been halted.
If, so to speak, the balance on the world markets changes, and such a large share of production essentially comes under the control of the United States, of course, the US increases its strategic and monetary stability. The oil and petroleum products market will depend on the will of Washington and will influence global prices, especially for Brent crude.
Trump did not stop there. The US president stated that China could also make a great deal with the US to buy Venezuelan oil. In Trump's opinion, Cuba will also want to sign a deal to buy oil.
It is impossible to imagine that the loss of, say, Russian oil volumes would maintain a normal situation in the global energy sector and the world economy.
It is worth noting that for the US to exert significant pressure, it will have to invest in Venezuela, which has been left to its fate for years.
Well, in fact, he did not develop it, and sometimes even destroyed, perhaps reluctantly, what had already been created before him in terms of oil production. And these 18% of the world's oil is just a nominal figure, which requires investment, but millions of dollars.
Venezuelan oil in Trump's hands would drive down prices and push Russian oil out of Western countries. And accordingly, Putin will never again see the kind of revenues that existed before. This means the end has come for the global ambitions of the Kremlin dictator.
We need to keep pressing. The EU is preparing a new large package of sanctions specifically against third countries, against buyers of Russian oil, against oil refineries.
Well, we will continue to do our job, push for sanctions, and strike the enemy on the battlefield.
Meanwhile, Ukraine and NATO have agreed on air defense cooperation priorities, including 16 HIMARS. And in general, Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov met with NATO representatives responsible for partnership with Ukraine. How has the new defense minister begun to change the situation in the armed forces of Ukraine? We'll tell you in the report.
Ukraine's new defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov, has begun reforming the Ukrainian army at a rapid pace, which has caused hysteria among Putin's supporters.
He truly is a competent organizer of drone production. And now he has set the goal of increasing the losses of the Russian armed forces to 50,000 per month, thanks to drones. And in general, I believe this is a serious enemy, a serious challenge.
The first and main statement from the new minister is to increase Russian soldier losses to an irreversible 50,000.
To make the cost of war for Russia so high that it simply cannot bear it. To stop the enemy by force. Stop the enemy by force.
He presented a general tactical and strategic plan for the challenge. The plan doesn't have any ambiguous arrows on the map, no wishful thinking, none of that general's verbosity. The new minister's strategic plan can be summarized in exactly 5 words and a single specific figure. The plan is officially articulated in the following manner: the total elimination of 50,000 Russian orcs every month. It is concise and to the point, constructive, and exceptionally realistic for our needs.
War correspondents are whining that such a figure is quite realistic, since Putin and his military leadership don't want to give up on the idea of meat assaults.
If we talk specifically, say, about losses, this desired target figure, unfortunately, it really can be achieved. Not so long ago, Magyar reported that they came up with a figure of destroyed targets, specifically personnel, confirmed at over 30,000. So essentially what we have is what comes to the troops in a month.
The second innovation from Fedorov is finally to disconnect Russians from contraband Starlinks and completely shut down their communications and drone control systems.
We need Starlink to work there because certain technologies are used that are important for us as well. They are connected to drones. There is another way to make sure that our Starlinks work, but the Starlinks that appear there by other means do not work. And so we are working with SpaceX to solve this issue.
Elon Musk himself supported the idea and said he would help in any way he could.
It seems that the steps we have taken to prevent the unauthorized use of Starlink by Russia have borne fruit. Let us know if additional measures are needed.
We came up with an even simpler method. As far as I understand, Starlink satellites will soon only serve those terminals in Ukraine that are on the so-called whitelist. Units in the armed forces of Ukraine and ordinary Ukrainians who have these very Starlinks need to add their terminals to the whitelist, register them there, and then continue using the internet as before. But Russians won't be able to do this. They won't be able to add their smuggled terminals to this whitelist. And that's why their terminals will all soon turn into pumpkins. Since
it hasn't even been a month since Fedorov was appointed Minister of Defense, and Russians are already in a real panic over the first new changes. What will happen next is anyone's guess, but it will be very interesting to watch.
What do you think about the latest events? We look forward to your comments. There's more to come.